Ugly Atheist. For this episode, I wanted to explore the idea of how you can tell if somebody who claims they are a Christian is really just pretending to be a believer and is not a true believer. In other words, how you can safely tell the difference between a believer and a non-believer. This is how to tell a true believer from a not a true believer. All right, let's get into it. One of the things that happens to us in life is that we hear a lot of claims, and based on our life experience, we weigh those claims, and this is almost a subconscious phenomenon where we kind of weigh the claims based on our life experience, and we determine if that claim is likely true or likely false, and we make a preliminary conclusion and carry on with our lives. But some claims are so phenomenal or so extraordinary that it requires a little bit more insight, or it requires a more emotionally invested process to determine if it's something we should invest our time and emotions into or not. So to give you an example that I often use, let's take the claim of, let's say when you're little and your parents tell you about Santa Claus. So you, let's say you're 3 or 4 years old and you still believe in Santa Claus. You think that you have no reason to believe your parents would be lying to you about it. They sound like they're being honest and truthful. Christmas morning comes, and lo and behold, there are the presents just like your parents said. So you, at that age, you literally have no reason to doubt your parents. But what happens is, and this happens to all of us with any given claim that we're emotionally invested in, is we reach an evidentiary, I'm not sure what the right word is, tipping point. And that is where we amass enough evidence to the contrary of a claim that our brain suddenly just realizes that, oh, I've been believing something that wasn't true. And that evidentiary tipping point, to go back to this analogy or illustration of the belief in Santa Claus, let's say you go to school and some of your classmates are saying, "Oh, Santa's not real," so maybe that's the first you've heard of this. Like, what? Oh, of course he's real. That's silly. So you kind of file that away in the back of your mind. It is a piece of evidence, but it's nowhere near. Maybe it's nowhere near pushing you to that evidentiary tipping point. And then one Christmas morning, maybe you're kind of looking at some of your gifts and you see a sign that clearly says "Made in China," and you're thinking, "Wait a minute! I thought all these things were made by elves in the North Pole." So maybe that's just another piece of evidence that you file away in the back of your mind, and you just kind of go on with life, go on with your belief in Santa Claus. But at some point, and it's different for everybody, of course, and we don't know when it's going to happen, but we reach this evidentiary tipping point where there's enough evidence to where your brain will suddenly just realize that the truth of the matter. And you're like, oh, okay, well, I guess my parents were lying to me, because there's no way Santa's real based on this, and this, or whatever. You know, we might not think of it that concretely, but we innately at some point just understand when enough evidence has built up. we reach that point where our worldview on that particular claim changes, does a 180. Now, something like the belief in Santa Claus, there's sort of a mild to moderate amount of emotional weight given to such a claim. It's nostalgic. It's a first kind of exciting. You associate your parents with that whole time in your life. You are excited about the opening the presents, and just the whole feeling of the magic of Christmas was kind of centered around that folklore. So it is probably for a lot of us, when we found out in our childhood that Santa wasn't real, it was a bit of a disappointment, and we kind of were maybe upset at our parents for lying to us. So most of us probably just like, oh, that sucks, and we just move on. The thing is about this evidentiary tipping point is once you reach it, you really only have two choices on how to respond. You can either begrudgingly accept the reality of it and kind of move on with your life, or you can continue on pretending to believe and going through the motions and continuing the traditions and the behaviors associated with that belief. But one thing you can't do is continue believing it. This is outside of your control. Once your brain reaches that tipping point where enough evidence has amassed and your brain finally understands the reality of the situation, you can't, it's like putting toothpaste back in a toothpaste tube. You can't undo that. Most of us, once we reach that tipping point, there's no going back. So what happens with something like Christianity that has significantly more emotional and cultural weight ascribed to it? So your entire community and culture is centered around this particular religion. All the holidays, all the friendships you make, it's all centered around this belief system. The politics, the art, everything about daily life, and the relationships you form are all centered around this one belief system. So what happens to the average person who is in a Christian culture, surrounded by Christians and a regular churchgoer, when somebody like that reaches that evidentiary tipping point, and this usually happens actually pretty young if they're a believer from childhood. I'd say maybe around 10 years old when you realize that like the stories of the Bible are not real. Like Noah's Ark couldn't possibly have happened. Adam and Eve and eating the apple, talking snakes, all of these stories. When you're fairly young, you gain an understanding of how the world works. You kind of figure out that those things didn't really happen. But because of the pervasive strength of the culture, the vast majority of people decide of those two choices. Remember, I talked about either embracing the reality of the situation or begrudgingly accepting it versus continuing on but pretending. The vast majority of people choose pretending. And I don't think there's that much wrong with that, to be honest. That's any normal human being would choose to keep pretending, because it's not the important thing is not the belief itself, but the important thing is the community and the relationships and the people that are in your life. That has significantly more weight than whether or not Adam and Eve really happened, or if all those animals really fit in the ark. or if there was a worldwide flood, or if creation is real. So I consider it normal behavior for someone to accept, or to not accept the truth of the matter, but to pretend like it's really true. In fact, the people who are like myself, who came to that evidentiary tipping point and decided to begrudgingly accept the reality that um, there's no, that Christianity is just a fable. Those of us who choose that route, I think there's probably some level of sociopathy involved with that. If you're willing to break ties with community and tradition and family for the sake of an ideal, that's typically, I would say, okay, well, there's two things that would cause somebody to do that: sociopathy, or being somewhere on the sociopathic spectrum, where you're you're autistic, sort of, maybe, where you don't value these connections and human relationships as much as you are in pursuit of truth, or the community that you happen to be immersed in is just so toxic that you kind of welcome this realization, and you're like, okay, whew, now I have an excuse to not hang out with these people and not be part of any of this mess. I'm gonna just go my own way, you know. And I think that's sort of what my situation was. I could have easily just continued pretending like everyone else does. So let's take a moment to explore how you would tell the difference between somebody who's just pretending versus a true believer. And there are true believers out there, and I commend them for believing, but it also demonstrates a severe case of gullibility. Let's get into how you can tell the difference when you meet somebody who says they're a Christian. So let's go through the average day of somebody who says that they're a Christian or claims to be a Christian. Let's say they wake up in the morning, they do a little bit of praying, maybe they have their quiet time with a cup of coffee. Then there's they go to work, get to work, and coworkers talk to them. Hey, Bob, did you see the game last night? Oh yeah, the game was great. You know, sports. I don't know much about sports, but hey, are you gonna? We have a meeting at 9 a.m. Are you gonna have those reports ready? Oh yeah, I should have those ready. And then maybe the believer goes out to lunch with their friends. They chit chat. Then after work, they drive home. Maybe spend time with the family. Do some pray before they eat. Have a little prayer time. Watch some TV or something, and then go to bed. What's lacking in that scenario is sort of a lack of urgency. And if you read the book of Acts in the Bible, I think that's kind of an outline of how a true believer would behave. And within reason, the book of Acts, it's written by the church leaders at the time, which I think it's Paul that wrote the book of Acts, or was it Luke? But one of the leaders. So it's hard to parse that leadership position, and because they have an incentive to push hard to grow the church, and to lead by example. So it's hard to gauge whether they're really believers or not. But certainly a lot of the followers back then were believers. And you can see what their lives were like. Their lives were all about, they were just singly focused. As Pastor Rick Warren might say, they are purpose-driven. The apostles and the disciples, they met in secret often because they were being persecuted. They risked their lives regularly. They were trying to grow the church because, remember, the core of Christianity is the command to make disciples of every nation. So that's sort of the blueprint for how someone who is a true believer would act. So let's go back to our example of, the average Christian going into the office. So you don't see any of that urgency in the daily life of somebody who claims to be a believer. So let's do a little thought experiment here to further illustrate the difference. Let's say late at night in your backyard, there lands a large alien spaceship, and you are just in utter speechless shock. A 10-foot alien comes out, and he looks down at you. You're trembling, and he says, you have 7 Earth days to get out of this city. Your family, your friends, get as many people out as you can, because I am going to destroy the city. There will be no buildings left standing. So let's say in this scenario, you have no reason to doubt that this is real, like it's not a hallucination. What do you think the next day at work is going to be like? Let's say this person goes to work. Hey, Bob, did you see the game last night? Look, F the game. You got to get home right now. Get your family, your kids, your pets, everyone you love into your vehicle and leave the city right away. And maybe some other office workers gather around to see the commotion. And you're like, look, everybody, listen to me. I know this sounds crazy. We all need to leave work right now, leave the office right now. We got to get in our cars. We got to vacate the city. Tell everyone you know that we got to get out of the city. The city is going to be destroyed in 7 days. And then, hey, well, we've got a meeting at 9 a.m. Do you have the reports ready? Look, screw those reports. I'm leaving work. I'm going to go tell as many people as I can. We got to get out of the city ASAP. So, given that scenario, you can see the very distinct differences between how person A and person B respond to a dire and drastic claim. And this encapsulates how you can tell somebody who's a true believer versus somebody who's just pretending. There, as I mentioned earlier, there's a distinct urgency in the believer, in the true believer. They're not messing around. They're not there to chit-chat. They're there on a mission to save lives. And they believe it, and they are going to spend every ounce of the energy they have trying to save as many people as they can. The average believer that you come across on a daily basis, the average person who claims that they're a Christian, does not have that urgency because they don't believe. They're pretending. They're cultural Christians. They're going through the motions. They're going through the facade for the sake of their relationships, for the sake of their families, for their friends, for their community. They're doing it for themselves. So I guess I'll wrap up with just that. Is it wrong to pretend like you're a believer? I don't think so. I think it's a very human thing to do. I think that I can't fairly fault anybody for pretending. I'll leave it at that. I'm Charlotte, and you're watching The Ugly Atheist. If you enjoy this kind of content, please like and subscribe. And yeah, I'll see you next time. Bye.